Next up, we have our panel on next generation batteries and critical mineral supply chains, joined by 4 excellent panelists here. I will just quick introduce them before we get into their remarks. So in the order of speaking, we have Charlie Vest, Associate Director at the Rhodium Group, where he supports Rhodium Group's research on the Chinese economy and US tech and economic policy. And previously, he worked in Beijing as a researcher at the China Energy Storage Alliance. Charlie's also a non-resident fellow with the National Bureau of Asian Research. Next up, and Charlie will be presenting sort of the US development strategy and policies around battery technology. Next up, we have Dr. Sangmin Shim, a professor at the Graduate School of Green Growth and Sustainability at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. Previously, he worked at the Asan Institute of Policy Studies and was a research fellow at the Sejong Institute, as well as a professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Dr. Shim and Charlie were both authors on our report that came out yesterday, the one on this big poster here, looking at US ROK cooperation across a range of technologies, which includes batteries. Dr. Shim will be presenting the Korean perspective on battery development strategies and policies. Next up, we have Clara Gillispie. She is an advisor at MBR and also serves as the official US delegate to the Energy Research Institute Network. Her work focuses on technology, energy, public health, and environmental policymaking in the Asia Pacific. She previously was the Senior Director for Trade, Economics, and Energy Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research, and had also previously worked at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy and the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. She'll be presenting a broader Indo-Pacific view, including Southeast Asia. And then finally, we have Grant Ray, Vice President of Global Market Strategy at Group 14, a battery technology company. And he leads the company's global market strategy and AI and digital efforts. And he has previously held senior positions at a number of companies, including Polysync, SF Motors, Alta Motors, and Piaggio. He'll be bringing the private sector perspective here and talking about the impact of these policies on the private sector. So with that, I will turn it over to Charlie to get us started.
Thanks very much. It's a delight to be here. Yeah, thank you all for joining for the afternoon session. I'm going to be very brief here, just outline a few thoughts on sort of where we ended up with the Biden administration strategy on EV battery development and where we're going with the Trump administration. So under the Biden administration, I think there were really, broadly speaking, 2 goals with U.S. industrial policy towards electric vehicle batteries. The first was to accelerate electrification. And to that end, they introduced a number of pretty substantial incentives under the IRA, as well as EPA standards to promote electric vehicle adoption that had a major effect on the market. So, we've been tracking at Rhodium Group. We're an independent advisory firm that looks at these things, tracking investment in these clean energy technologies in the United States. And in Q1 2022, there was about $2 billion of investment in battery supply chain. In Q4 2024, that was $12 billion. And 40% of that is Korean investment. So massive investment, mostly coming from US partners, almost entirely from US partners like Japan and Korea in the supply chain. The second goal was really reducing dependence on China. So introducing a number of trade and national security oriented barriers, Section 301 tariffs on EVs and batteries coming from China, the ICTS investigation into connected vehicles to limit Chinese hardware and software going into vehicles in the United States, and then conditioning these incentives on gradually excluding inputs from China. And so together, this formed a strategy where the U.S. was going to create a large EV market that anchored an ex-China supply chain for electric vehicle batteries. There were trade-offs involved with this, balancing EV adoption and restricting inputs from China. It's well known that the Biden administration had to take a step back from restrictions on critical minerals coming from China going into batteries that would ultimately qualify for the 30D tax credit for clean vehicles. That was pushed back from 2025 to 2027. But the result was really substantial success in garnering investment, mostly by Korean firms, as I mentioned, to the extent that cells and batteries manufacturing in the United States is on track to meet pretty much all domestic demand by 2030. So, the United States is still very far behind in EV adoption overall. New sales in EVs account for about 10% of overall auto sales compared to China's about 50%. And China remains dominant in upstream supply chains, which, as John mentioned earlier, is now using for leverage by imposing export controls on things like graphite, which is an aim of policy going forward to limit that. So let's look ahead to Trump. Different priorities, to say the least, but I think some important similarities as well. Trump doesn't care much about electrification, even though he may be buying a Tesla, and wants to save this money for tax cuts by rolling back regulation and potentially repealing some of these IRA credits like 30D. Much less interested in friendshoring and would rather make it here in the United States. But the strategic imperative to reduce dependence on China remains. We're seeing that already with promises to review and expand the ICTS rule to cover new technologies. We're seeing it in the America First investment policy, which is going to necessarily, with the help of Congress, expand CFIUS's jurisdiction to cover greenfield investments, which are aimed at limiting the ability of Chinese companies overall, but battery companies, I think, in particular, from participating in U.S. markets. And like with the Biden administration, there are going to be trade-offs involved. We can't solve for all of these things at once. And we're seeing this already with some of the tariffs that have been promised against Canada and Mexico, right? Where the 25% that was going to be applied across the board say, well, okay, we'll roll that back such that things that qualify for the USMCA will be exempt, at least for a time. But anything that goes outside of USMCA is going to face those tariffs. And what that really does is essentially goes to Mexico and say, well, anything that meets rule of origin requirements for USMCA in the auto sector is fine. Anything that has too much Chinese content in it that has to, that won't go through USMCA is going to face a 25% tax. And so you're already seeing these kernels of real strategic thinking amid all the chaos that actually works towards some of these goals that go back to the Biden administration and even before. So last point, what I worry about is that, the Biden administration sort of had this two-leg strategy of building up a strong EV market and then putting up strong barriers to China. I worry that with the rollback of EPA regulations and potential repeal of the various tax incentives, that we're missing a leg on this strategy. And this puts investments from Korean companies, for instance, that have made a big bet on America's EV industry at risk. It also makes it harder to bring partners on board when we talk about sort of building up these ex-China supply chains. And it also puts the onus even more on tech breakthroughs to reduce costs and reduce dependence in some of these areas where dependence on China remains a pretty substantial challenge, which I think we'll talk about later in this panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. And over to you, Dr. Shim.
All right. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak in front of this wonderful audience. And it's a great pleasure to talk to you about the Korean side of things on batteries and how the government has been sponsoring the tech innovation on the battery manufacturing and the technological development, and what challenges would the Trump administration would present to the further cooperation between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea on the battery technology innovation. First, let me start by saying that the joint travel that the Korea and the United States have been making in terms of the developing EV industries and the battery industries have been so successful that we hope to stay on course, hoping that at the same level of the subsidy regimes will be relatively intact, although that's more hopeful than what we will witness in the future. Secondly, we also, Korean businesses have certain vulnerabilities in terms of securing our critical minerals and the precursor materials. Basically, we depend so much upon China to source these materials. And so we also have some imperatives to win ourselves one way or another from the too much dependence on Chinese supply. So we actually share supply chain issues and vulnerabilities between Korea and the United States. That was really a driving force for some of the Korean battery manufacturing companies to jump in the United States to make a huge investment to make both countries mutual, reciprocally beneficial, thriving and alive and thriving by providing good infrastructure of battery manufacturing in the U.S. soil, while having the Korean businesses, battery businesses, having some strong footing to be in black ink with the help of the IRA and especially the advanced manufacturing production credit under 47X. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep.
So this was a nice combination, and then the Trump administration came in, and one of the executive orders that he signed in was to temporarily suspend the reimbursement, the reimbursement to the manufacturers and the companies made available under the IRA for a certain period of time. It was up to 90 days. Or could be longer. I don't remember the duration of the time, but at least for now, this payment made available under the IRA is being suspended. And the Korean battery companies have been quite experiencing some slowdown in their EV sales, which affected the sales in the batteries as well. And confronted with that, with the more slowdown in the federal help, just bringing up their business baseline would definitely devastate the business environment for the Korean battery business environment. So what could we expect from going forward with this Trump administration? We hope that some of these IRA-based incentives would remain available to the Korean battery companies, not only to help these battery companies stay afloat, but to continue to provide jobs and prosperity to those states that have made the difficult decision to host these the manufacturing facilities from Korea. And secondly, to continue to work together to find a very friendly environment for the production, research, development, and production of next generation batteries, because it would take some time and efforts and human capital to eventually get there. Because we are working on this new generation of technologies like particularly the silicon carbon technology that the Group 14 is specializing on, and also some other sulfide-based or oxide-based all solid batteries, all solid state batteries that are going well in their development, but also require some significant time to master the technique and show some level of the commercial viability. So to realize all of these benefits, we really hope that the new regulatory environment surrounding the battery and the EV industries within the United States will go through not much change. With that, I would like to just stop by making my comments.
Thank you so much. And over to you, Clara.
Great. Thank you, Doug. And I want to begin by congratulating Charlie and Sangmin for the really incredible papers that you've written. If you haven't had a chance to read them yet, I highly recommend it. I think you've both outlined a very meaty agenda for what is required and necessary to enhance our battery security, our battery supply chain security. The question I found myself asking after reading these papers was essentially, is this an agenda that we can pull off if we're thinking about this purely bilaterally, or even primarily bilaterally? And I want to zoom in particular on the critical minerals aspect of this, because I think that's an area where the answer is very emphatically no. The International Energy Agency just came out with this fantastic note in the last week that essentially said we are entering this new exciting phase of EV deployment where we're starting to see adoption accelerate. And a big part of that is the fact that battery prices have come down pretty significantly. And there are many reasons for that, but one of the big ones they singled out in particular is the fact that if you look compared to 2022, the price of lithium has declined about 85%. That's one of those very exciting drops that almost immediately asks the question, okay, are we in this phase with our critical mineral supply chains, with production, where we're seeing a much more stable market, much healthier, robust, or are we really just still somewhere mid this period of volatility? And spoiler alert, my answer is probably closer to the second part of this. And there are two big reasons for that. The first is that we're talking about what is ultimately a very, very concentrated map. It's very concentrated in terms of who we're talking about for extraction, for production, for processing of various elements, China being a large part of that, but even beyond that, very, very concentrated. It's also just the fact that we're seeing this exponential rise in demand growth. To go back to lithium, the expectation is that between roughly now and 2040, we would see demand for lithium increase about 40 times over. That number is less sharp with some of the other critical minerals that we talk about, but really still pretty pronounced. Nickel and cobalt, for example, an increase of somewhere on the order of 20 to 25 times what we're seeing the demand of now. So if you have one takeaway from my remarks that at this point, it would be that everything we're talking about in terms of increasing production in the United States really matters. It's an important part of this picture, but it's not going to be the sufficient answer that will get us out of this very tricky situation where we are really over-reliant on a couple of nodes in the supply chain. There are some very good takeaways too when you start to look at this map of who beyond our two countries can do more. You start to see partners and regular allies pop up in this space. It's Australia, for example, as a big potential part of this extraction for lithium. It's countries such as Indonesia, also very big in the extraction market for nickel. As you start to move up that value chain, it gets a little trickier with manufacturing. It narrows more and more towards China again. So again, some very clear action items of areas we want to do the work on. Part two of this, as you might already be guessing, if we focus fully on just that supply side question of it, we might do a great job of expanding the market in terms of what's being produced, but not really address our fundamental challenges. We will definitely find more consumers who are very eager and enthusiastic for all of these minerals. The solutions here include things like improving the efficiency of our use of these minerals. It focuses on recycling. And I particularly wanted to single out these two because these are things that are often brought up in conversations about what countries should do individually. And there's some great success stories here. Korea's work in particular in critical mineral recycling being a big one. But these are also conversations that are very deeply international. Malaysia and India in particular as two countries that jump out to me that are very active in the electronics recycling and just broader recycling space. Things that help us to make these processes more viable, also help us to bring costs down. I could go on in this list, but maybe just to say, so how do we actually have some of these conversations about knitting together more of a strategy with our partners? Certainly, I think it should begin with the conversation of joint U.S. and Korea leadership in this space. We've already heard the benefits and value there, the areas where we have very common interests. If we're going around country to country in some of these conversations, it's not going to be a surprise to anyone in this room that there are real questions right now about the bandwidth that we have available to have these very essential conversations. So there are three forums in particular I just want to throw out there and then come back to in the Q&A to talk a little bit more about what it could look like. We heard some in the first session this morning about the importance of APEC as a forum in AI and digital spaces. I would argue it's even more essential in some of our energy and natural resource conversations. The two others that make the list for me, the East Asia Summit, again, a very important place for this, as well as the G7. These are forums that have developed competencies, not just on really the nitty-gritty of the regulations, the nitty-gritty of having very good energy and mining expertise, but also bringing these back to the strategic dimensions where we want to be thinking about this as not just the whole value chain, but as part of the larger value chain that we're trying to develop. If I had 5 more minutes, I would also say, and several strategic initiatives, including some of interest to the Trump administration, but I'm going to end it there, come back in the discussion.
Great, thank you, Clara. And then finally over to Grant for more of the private sector perspective.
Hey there, Grant, right. So I'm going to come from a slightly different angle. First, for everyone, Group 14 makes a synthetic replacement for graphite that is silicon-based. So we make something that gives about 50% more energy density and allows for some pretty radical fast charging times that are definitely pushing, let's just call it envelopes of what we think about what it means to recharge devices, what it thinks about, recharging things like vehicles, and what it means to like how we start to develop and how some of our partners start to develop products that are going to be coming out in the future, or in some cases are out now. So we've got some factories spread out in a few different places. While we are founded and based here in Washington with a factory here just north of Seattle, we've got another major factory that's coming online in eastern Washington in Moses Lake. And then we've got, of course, a partnership with SK for a joint venture that is out in Sangju, South Korea, that's able to really push with the relationships we have and with the engagement that we have with a lot of our Asian partners and customers, which is, of course, is really important considering that, from that joint venture factory, we would be a 3-hour flight from all of the major players in the battery industry. So it becomes critically important that, from our perspective, we ground ourselves in the quality and the nature of our relationships as we look to move forward. Whether we see challenges in, say, supply chain constraints from, natural things like a pandemic, or more, political challenges like what we see ourselves going into now with tariff wars, because of the nature of these global relationships, because of the ability to synthetically produce our materials anywhere in the world, we're able to kind of ease a lot of those constraints for our partners. So we can manufacture to meet local needs from a global perspective through modular manufacturing, which puts us in a kind of different dynamic right now. We see ourselves having, challenges with, using raw materials for, geopolitical leverage, like with graphite. For some people, that's horrible. For others of us, it's not so bad because we happen to be a replacement for some of those minerals. But I think what's going to be coming for us is how we are able to, work on maintaining and growing those relationships as we start to see these new coming challenges with how we start to think about IP control, and really what it means from, even from a data perspective, how we start to deliver and control the messages and the technology. And I think what I'm going here is that when we start to look at next generation devices that are going to be AI enabled, say with, a device we're in now in the millions, which is Honor's cell phone, their new flag tier or top tier AI enabled phone that's in millions, it's our material that's powering that. But when we start to see AI move to edge, things start to get a little bit weird, right? In terms of how we think about, where the data lives, where the kind of capabilities live. But we see an ability to lean on strong partnerships that we actually have with Korea to be able to meet those needs no matter where they are, and to be able to kind of alleviate a lot of those constraints. So whether it's, giving, energy security, which is incredibly important here in the US, to all of our partners and customers here, and to be able to also work with that with partners like SK in South Korea, or with ATL and TDK in Japan, which is a deep partner of ours as well. All of these things start to matter. And also we have capabilities with a precursor for a raw material, silane gas, in Germany. That's the world's most efficient capability for silane gas, and we're on the verge of bringing that technology here to the US. That's one of the last things that we were able to accomplish with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. We were able to get all of that secured and are now in basically the stages to start moving that forward. So how we're able to bring kind of these, next generation capabilities and technologies for power and security, at a global level, and to be able to work with partners that, even as we navigate these kinds of complex, trade challenges and policy challenges, that we're able to work with partners to be able to still deliver next generation capabilities and technologies.
Great. Thank you all for your opening remarks. I guess to begin with, for Charlie and Sangmin, Clara mentioned maybe some challenges around achieving some of the goals you put forth in the report. Would you two mind just touching on some of the recommendations you made in the report and then sort of react to whether or how you think they may be achieved? And then Grant, I'll probably follow up and ask if you think those recommendations just from the private sector align with your interests.
Yeah, maybe just a comment. One of the key takeaways from our report is just the need to up science and technology cooperation between American universities and Korean companies. There have been some very successful examples of collaboration between American universities and Samsung, for instance, Samsung SDI, in introducing new technologies and innovating on existing products. So, that's one of those areas where I think there's a lot of room to grow, and collaboration between Korean companies, just from an export control perspective. I've spoken to folks who work in this space that, we're at a point now where, the export control lines for high density batteries really kind of matter when you're talking about doing innovation in this space. And so it's, if you're a Chinese researcher in the United States working in an academic context, it's fine because there's certain carve outs that allow folks to work on these technologies. But as soon as you take it commercial, it becomes much, much harder. And so there's very practical advantages for researchers who are working in this space to collaborate with Korean firms.
I'd like to add two more things that Korea and the United States can work together to make this battery industry a much more robust one. One is to do some more efforts to develop a workforce to actually just run the factories and facilities so that these two countries can always rely on each other when there is certain shortage in labor for some reasons, and then the other country can come to the rescue. And the other thing is that we can also work together between governments to harmonize upon certain technical specification of the battery capacity and battery technology, so that no companies would be forced to meet so many different standards with the technologies that they have already owned and mastered, so that there will be a less regulatory burden for these battery companies and the subsidiaries moving forward to just mature this wonderful business environment called the battery technology related field. That's it.
Thanks. And Grant, do you have any response to that, or what would you say the private sector's goals would be or objectives for policy? Priorities?
It's a bit challenging. And I guess for us, it's because, at least in my response to that, because we've had such a fantastic relationship with how we've been able to work with, say, SK within South Korea to help us navigate a lot of the local laws in terms of how it's allowing us to scale as fast as possible. By building really strong relationships with our partners, we've found ways to be able to lean on those, much more sophisticated partners to allow us to scale as fast as possible. And so we see challenges in policies in some places that may be daunting for smaller companies, but from our perspective, we lean on those larger partners like an SK or a TDK or a Porsche or a Microsoft to be able to basically help carry us through some of these things that we don't have a lot of experience with, but they've navigated before, and it's ushered us through in a way that has eased a lot of those growing pains so that we can scale as fast as possible.
Great. And then Clara, you mentioned the role of some APAC, East Asia Summit, and G7 looking in the broader region. How do you think do you think their policy priorities align, but then how can they contribute to achieving some of these goals?
That's a great question. I mean, so big picture, multiple policy priorities really varies per country, but across the board, some of the things we've already heard in the US and Korea context are equally true. They are hoping to capture larger elements of this value chain, support their own economic growth, get ahead of some bottlenecks to that potential economic growth. So not just this industry, but the battery industry to be able to do other things as well. And then one that I hear a little bit more prominently than I would say conversations in the US at this moment in time is there are deep concerns still very high on the agenda about decarbonizing transit in particular. So they're looking at where this fits into it and the multiple different competing technologies and systems they're trying to figure out investment in. In terms of what that means, in terms of what they're hoping to hear from the US and Korea in particular, new investment is always a big one. You know, Indonesia has been touting the fact that it is scaling up EV battery production in its own country. It is looking at ways to take that further. It is looking at ways that it might position itself for if companies are leaving China to be that nearby country and partner where you can very quickly ramp up manufacturing. I think the challenge with that one is always, is the environment for doing business right in that sense? And that, again, immediately speaks to these larger conversations, bringing in US perspectives, bringing in industry, others. Maybe one last one that I'll hit on because I really liked Sangmin bringing up the workforce. For Southeast Asia at large in general, though I'm thinking more developing Southeast Asia, there is also quite a workforce development need for the regulators themselves. Policymakers are trying to figure out what's the actual legislation that's going to make some of these things move, that's going to make adoption easier, that's actually going to simplify these systems. There are things that ASEAN is doing in this space where there's a natural opportunity for the US and Korea through the East Asia Summit to work more on standards for batteries, for chargers, other things. So.
Thank you all. So all great recommendations. As we all are aware, we are sort of in a period of maybe unpredictable policy, particularly coming out of the current US administration and a changing approach that Charlie had mentioned to the sort of green energy and EV industry in the US. So in light of this, I guess I would probably start with Dr. Shim and how you think this may impact the Korean market and Korean battery makers' strategies. But then I would also like to move to Charlie for how you think the US market is adapting to this, and then to Grant for sort of the impact on whether your company or the broader private sector involved with battery production.
Well, to my best knowledge, if the supposed the financial help stop flowing in to the Korean battery manufacturing companies, then Korean manufacturing companies might have to think twice about whether they would continue down the road of building more facilities within the U.S. soil, because their financial viability is at stake. With more investment, without the prospect of recouping the costs with the help of the federal money, they might have to think twice about where to locate their new battery manufacturing facilities. Some parts of those new efforts may be directed to Southeast Asia, where there's a great need to develop their own battery industries. And some parts of efforts may be directed to some other global South nations, including India, where there is a great potential to quickly grow these battery industries if they want it to. So the business strategies for the Korean battery manufacturing companies might change. And with that will be a less possibility for the continued collaboration between Korea and the United States in terms of developing next generation battery technologies. And that would be somewhat more critical than relocating some of the pre-existing assets on the battery manufacturing, because the future of these EVs and the batteries would definitely depend upon finding solutions to the current the problems that the current generation technology, battery technology has, which is about the limited driving range and with some unsecured safety issues, and then the specification issue as well. So unless these issues get resolved through the collaborative efforts between these two nations, especially with the change in the regulatory environment within the United States, and it would be quite a rocky travel from the Korean business perspective.
And just so I make sure I understand your question, you're really sort of asking, like, if the U.S. takes a step back from support for the EV industry, like, what are we at risk of losing? Yeah. I mean, and what needs to be done to okay. So first thing on that, I mean, our objective here as good stewards of both the environment and U.S. policy is to try and keep as much of the IRA as possible. It's really been a success story in driving investment in the United States and promoting EV adoption. And that's a good thing for everybody involved. Second thing is to try and resolve as quickly as possible trade fights with Canada and Mexico in the auto supply chain. I mean, the kind of cost increases that are being discussed from these 25% increase taxes for auto parts and incoming vehicles in the United States, like, $3,000 to $10,000. We become an afterthought in the global auto industry at costs like that. And I think maybe the way to frame this in discussion with policymakers is this isn't just about EVs. This is about, the future of the automotive sector. This is about autonomous driving. This is about sort of where all of these new technologies, where the United States really does want to compete, are coming in. And to give a very concrete example of that, we saw just within the past week announcements by VW and by BMW that are partnering with Chinese companies in LiDAR and with in-vehicle software for vehicles that are going to be sold outside of China. And so if the goal of the United States across a range of different critical technology sectors is to set national security oriented barriers up against Chinese supply chains to as much as possible, we can't be an afterthought in the global automotive industry. And so that requires us really continuing to make big investments in the future of transportation and electrification, so that we don't get left behind.
I think it's going to be a little bit of a challenge for a lot of the players in the battery space that are solely focused on EV. But for those of us that are a little bit more upstream in the battery supply chain, frankly, to pull back on EV means that there's room to move on to other targets that in some cases might be larger, like the coming data center boom for AI-enabled data centers and devices. That's no small thing. When we look at the numbers for what's expected for growth for data centers, it is gargantuan. I mean, and a lot of those are still powered off of lead-acid batteries. So there is a massive shift that needs to happen. And when you look at what the power requirements are for what these data centers are going to need and need already, the technologies that they're using are already basically limited and capped out. So I think the challenge would be that if we roll back what our progress has been for EVs, is that the local automotive industries, they're going to start seeing real competition for critical materials and in some cases next generation capabilities, because those will start going to other players.
Thank you. And then Clara, from your perspective, Dr. Shim mentioned potentially some Korean investment shifting to Southeast Asia if conditions change in the U.S. Indonesia has established its first battery manufacturing plant. Do you see that expanding in the region? Do they have the capabilities, and kind of how do you see that playing out?
That's a great question. I mean, at minimum, it's very high on the policy agenda of multiple countries, right? So in addition to Indonesia, you have Thailand talking about this quite extensively. Charlie mentioned India, outside of Southeast Asia, but likewise as well, is hoping to capture it. What it needs to make those different factories work or other kind of elements of this really depends on the geography. And I liked what Grant was saying right now about power sector and the availability of electricity. That's a huge part of that also has strong overlaps with the batteries. So that's great. Also challenging is just, in some cases, aggregating the demand that will make these projects work. So, it is great to have a very successful, vibrant battery factory in Indonesia. It is less great if the market that it can tap into is limited by, non-tariff barriers, tariffs as well, other things that restrict trade and other development. That's just going to inherently make it trickier and smaller. So some of what they're looking for too is ways to try and think about knitting together that market. So.
Great. I'm going to go with one more question, but I would encourage the audience to start thinking about any as well, and then we'll have a mic ready to go for you after this. But you both touched upon, well, I guess in the US, a lot of the conversation focuses around EV batteries, but there's obviously a lot of other emerging applications for them. Grant mentioned data centers and then grid storage for a couple. I guess I would ask this to anyone, but both for the US and Korea policy perspective, are we focusing enough on these sort of emerging battery technologies besides EV batteries?
There's a whole lot going on, yes. There is a ton of work happening. There's a ton of research happening. I think it was late February, Google put out a blog that they put out 100 million lithium-ion cells in data centers. So this shift, this work that's happening right now, it's really easy to read a 6-month-old paper and call it old news because of how fast the work is happening and how fast the research is happening. But it is an explosive sphere for learning and change and shifts in technology as we start to really kind of grapple with what these shifting understandings in demand really is. And just to touch on kind of Clara, what you were saying in terms of like demand for domestic EV versus global, that global demand is still gargantuan and it is still growing and it is still growing rapidly. Just because we here in the US are saying, oh, it's diminishing, it is skyrocketing everywhere else. So within at least the private industry perspective, it's, we look at an energy demand of at least 50% versus a global battery capability of 25%. And there is a gulf between the two. So anything that we make is going to go somewhere. It just really depends on, where that void is that needs to be filled and has the most pull.
Let me just make one more comment upon the other use of this battery technology, which is to supply power to the electric power to the general household using what we call as the long duration energy storage system, which is basically a collection of small, the medium scale battery storage devices harmonized and commonly controlled by some artificial intelligence technology so that they will know how to provide electricity to where it is needed almost at real time using this AI technology. And there is a growing interest, at least in the Korean context, about the possible use of this technology because we will have to spend a lot of money to build a new power plant, which will take time and huge capital. Compared with that, this long-term, long-duration energy storage is gaining more interest in terms of the economic viability and in terms of this going through certain regulatory hurdles. Because to build the typical nuclear, any type of power plant, we need certain licensing approval processes and the siting process, and all of which will take a significant time to just make it, to try and finish.
All right. Any audience questions? I see one from Olivia over here.
Hi, Olivia Truesdale from George Washington University. I had a question pertaining to not just the issue of batteries, but thinking about the other essential infrastructure for EVs, for example, to be available and desirable in the US market. I know South Korea and the US have invested a lot of money together to increase production capacity in the United States, but there are major barriers like lack of chargers in adequate locations for people to want to get electric vehicles. I've talked to a number of folks who are maybe looking at buying a car, who are reluctant to get an EV, not because they don't see the value of the electric vehicle, but because they don't know if they'll be able to get to where they're supposed to go with that electric vehicle, or maybe there's the lack of charging infrastructure in either their apartment or their home. So I was curious about your thoughts, not only just on the EV side, but on the other required infrastructure that seems to not be getting as much attention.
Yeah, I mean, the charging infrastructure subsidies are going to be another sort of big question for, where Congress and the administration takes this next. But it's exactly as you say. It's one of the areas where there does need to be substantial more investment for, if we really want to see a greater electric vehicle adoption in the U.S. I doubt that's going to be an area of great focus for the administration, but it is going to be a headwind for sure.
Well, in the current context, the Korean government is really anxious to increase the charging capacity at least in public along the public roads, so that people will have less concern about their driving range and feeling the need to just recharge as often as possible. This what we call as the range anxiety will start to disappear when when people driving these EVs will more likely find charging stations available every 50 kilometers, and that is what the Korean government intends to accomplish within next 5 to 10 years. But it's only in plan, so we will have to see how this implementation will move forward.
Thank you. Oh, no. Any other audience questions?
Yeah, mine's hopefully a quick question, actually. Yeah, someone mentioned recycling. How much is, say we're 100% good at recycling, say we get to this utopian level, how much does that affect the critical mineral supply chains? So in other words, can we recoup a lot by just looking at the recycling side?
Well, technologically, we can recycle almost 100% of the critical mineral by using some chemical process and in addition to other some mechanic process as well. The question here is whether we can reach the commercial viability of that technology, which is not up there yet. So probably one answer to lowering down the cost of using this technology to recycle this critical mineral is to basically by scaling it up at least encourage or force some of the manufacturers of batteries to at least a supply portion of their the critical mineral needs from these recycling businesses. That is gaining some interest, but it's not caught the eyes of the regulatory bodies yet. But at least I know one example of one Korean company working together with the United States battery recycling company, which is Li-Cycle. And I think this joint effort by the Li-Cycle and the SK On, that will try to economize upon this technology by experimenting with it first. And if they find some potential for success, it's by scaling it up to reach the economic viability of that technology.
I'll jump in on this. There's another aspect of this as well, and that is that we may quickly find ourselves in a scenario where we don't need to recycle nearly as much, right? When we've got a scenario where, we have partners now that are seeing battery life cycles in the 1,500 and 2,000 life cycle range. And we also have partners that are looking at, giving cells multiple lives. So whether it goes from, high performance vehicle to sedan to van to bus to grid, and all of a sudden extending the life cycle of a single product over 50 to 100 years, it starts to shift what the dynamic is in terms of what we need to do for really going through the process of tearing something apart and rebuilding, which in itself has its own energy needs.
Thanks. We'll go to Nelson Dong here next.
I was wondering if you, in particular, Charlie, could comment on the ownership and control of the global mining industry and who is able to supply the critical minerals outside of the Chinese.
Right. Yeah. So the way that the current restrictions around foreign entities of concern are set up is that there are carve-outs available up to a certain ownership threshold for Chinese mining interests. I think it's up to 25%, who can still qualify for providing minerals that go in and it not being kosher. Now there are a lot of companies out there that are mining this stuff in Australia and elsewhere, as Clara mentioned. The challenge really remains in the refining side. That the vast majority of those processes, particularly for lithium, take place in China, and it's a very low margin industry. It's very energy intensive. It's not particularly clean, and so it's not a very attractive industry for businesses to get into unless there is a very strong demand signal from a select group of countries that have a very strong EV industry that have decided that we're not, for national security reasons, going to buy the stuff from China at all. And I guess what I was alluding to in my comments is that if the United States doesn't really become that market and can't sort of build momentum for a unified group of sort of an ex-China trading bloc in these industries, it's going to be harder to do that. Clara, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
I'm going to give a plug for another NBR product. So about 2 years ago now, our energy security program actually did a really great report looking at critical minerals at large. And one of the essays in it does break down the global market of, okay, here's the role of China, but who besides China has both the just geological potential of joining into this market, if we are talking about extraction in particular, and then who has appetite to be doing more in this space. So, in addition to Indonesia and Australia, Chile is on that list, scattered others in Southeast Asia, although from a much lower base in the potential as well. The U.S. has more geological potential than we are tapping into at the moment. The reasons why we're not is, I'd say, everything that Charlie hits upon there. One other kind of wrinkle I will add on to this too is it's not only that it is a very low margin industry, although yes, it is very low margin, very difficult to do cleanly and well. China's outsized role in multiple aspects of this supply chain, so the extraction and then moving upstream, talking about the end use, talking about manufacturing, processing, has also given it an ability in some cases to command below market prices for critical minerals. So that's another challenge that companies are facing as they think about how do I move into this space.
Yeah, and it has also now become the subject of Chinese export controls, which were just introduced, some for lithium extraction in January of this year. So it's getting tied up in some of that as well.
Any further audience questions? We have time for one or two more, probably. All right, maybe I will throw a last question at you then, and we can wrap it up. You had mentioned U.S.-China competition, which hasn't come up a whole lot during this conversation, but given the sort of turbulent policy environment at the moment, and you mentioned some of the dangers of that tariffs might, how they might impact the U.S. auto market, et cetera. If that situation continues to exacerbate and countries in the middle are kind of pushed away from the U.S., how do you see that competition playing out on critical mineral supply chains, the battery industry, but even more broadly, how that just impacts U.S. technology and innovation?
Well, just one very quick comment here. I mean, we've already seen from, I guess, December of last year, the Chinese export controls on graphite have been in place for some time, but there's still been flows through. It's really just a licensing requirement that's been put in place. But in response to the most recent round of semiconductor export controls that were discussed in the last panel, China introduced stricter end use and end user restrictions that are showing, that there's much greater focus now on sort of where this graphite is going. We don't know yet who is going to be allowed to get this graphite and to what extent that's going to be a lever that China leans on. The outcome, if China does decide to restrict graphite exports, and I'm curious, this is Grant exactly to the question that maybe we'll turn to you, but like to the extent that China does use this as a lever to try and go after U.S. manufacturers or manufacturers who are based in the U.S., it does validate 100% all of the concerns that the United States and Europe and others have about being overly dependent on Chinese supply chains. So if we really do see, Chinese graphite exports to the United States go to zero, it's going to create much stronger urgency to find alternative supply, invest in it, invest in new technologies like Group 14 is working on. Am I right on that, Grant? I mean, how do you see that from like a private sector perspective?
Well, I mean, for us, it's going to be gangbusters, right?
Right.
But I also see this as, I see it as a little bit more nuanced because it's, how are they putting restrictions on graphite versus how they're putting restrictions on, finished product, right? And that's where the difference is going to be. So what they're really doing right now is, so they're putting restrictions on supply so that we can't build up an industry, not that we can't be a consumer of their product. And so for us, ultimately that's still from, supplying to other manufacturers in the U.S., it's still fantastic for us. But because of the way that there is a global demand and because of the nature that we've been building global partnerships over the last 10 years, we're going to be able to kind of weather those storms a lot easier because of the nature of just, where demand is coming from for EVs and where our customers are really going to be kind of wanting to be able to implement product using our materials, right? But when we look at what these kind of, supply constraints are going to look like for if China starts to really ratchet up, then it's going to cause some real challenges in terms of manufacturing in the U.S. And it will be really interesting to see, like at that point, if we're still, so unfriendly with, say, Mexico and Canada when we need them to make our batteries.
Okay, great. I think we're just about at time, so I think we'll just wrap it up there. Thank you all for joining.